we gulp down our drinks. We get our coffee to go and we're drinking it on the go, and we're not stopping and letting our body relax. And if you can even just take a little bit of your coffee or tea, a little bit of your drink, and let yourself just be and think about how you're feeling for a few moments, and let yourself connect to the plants, because coffee does come from a plant. Tea does come from a plant. All those tisanes, they come from a plant, and many of them are medicines. They do change your mood. They can help with your sore throat. I'm not saying you shouldn't take antibiotics at the right times, but when you just have a little tickle in your throat and you don't need to see the doctor, sometimes that sage tea, that sage that you grow in your garden, can make a beautiful tea that soothes your throat. Sometimes that headache that's starting, the smell from a mint tea can help ease that headache. And then you can decide, do I need the medication, or did I just need a little bit of relaxation time away from it all? What type of medicine did I really need? Over to you, Danielle, with the agenda.
We're moving forward with our session today. And one of the questions that I really want to bring forward for the group is just that real connection and relationship that we have with ourselves and with plants, and the idea of well-being. And what does your thoughts and perspectives, and what is your actual definition of well-being? I'm curious to wonder within our group here today, if you can share within the chat, even if you're just writing it down and thinking about it throughout the session, to share at the end or now, if you're feeling that you'd like to do that. But I just want to create this invitation to ask this question to yourself, and then creating this collaborative space where we can think about together, what is our connection with plants? What is our definition of well-being? What does well-being look like as an educator? And how does that create some balance? And again, today we really wanted to invite inquiry, and in an appreciative way, and in a space where we can really sit together and think about the importance of plants, the importance of wellness, and how they're both combined, and then combining it with these pieces that wrap around with Indigenous knowledge, and that this Indigenous knowledge is a piece of all of these threads that really have been connecting us for forever in how to be sustainable as a person, in our spiritual well-being, in our physical well-being, and how we need to look after Mother Earth.
We really would like to hear, how do you like to enjoy interacting with plants?
So these questions, again, now you've got that first question about what is your definition of well-being, and how do you interact, and what is your engagement, what is your relationship, and then how do we create that culture of health and well-being that is connected to plants, and thinking about our pedagogical practice. So these are the questions that we had within the abstract, but we want you to hold tight to them. And I want you to actually look at these questions right now and think about, what question am I actually drawn to? Or what piece of it that I need opportunity to grow into? And I want you to sit with that, because these are the places that we can dig into our roots and be able to think about, how can I pull them up a little bit, just to take a little bit closer look at myself and your practice, and then how can I build those pieces in myself to deepen my awareness of my well-being and the importance of well-being, your well-being, and also connection with our plant kingdom, the land, air, water, and all the beings. And then how do we continue to deepen and generate our kinship, our relationship, and our fellowship with all of our relationships, creating what I love. And as Sheila, when we were thinking about this, the one thing that I remembered hearing when we traveled to Italy is, when I heard of the educators speaking, they don't just say, oh, I want the children to meet their milestones. They're like, I want to create a global citizen. And I would love to create a global citizen that's really wrapping themselves within Mother Nature. So the next piece is thinking about the 4 R's, but how do they actually sit with you? And I want to invite this again, the space where you can think about what ways am I being respectful? How am I being reciprocal? How am I being relevant? And how am I being responsible? And if you were to look at your practice right now or where you're at personally, which R would you say that you sit in the most? And which R do you think you could grow into? So I want you to write this down for yourself so you're able to look at it closely and be able to sit with it. Because sometimes when we sit with these different beautiful values or our ethics or thinking about practice, I want you to be able to stretch and saying, okay, how can that look like in this way? And for specifically for this session, it's looking at your well-being and your connection to plants. And how does that create balance?
One of the reasons, too, that we're really looking at plants is that plants are a way to connect us to the land. And when we're talking about a connection to the land, we're also including that connection to the air, to the water, to all the beings that we are related to. So I will bring up a little poster with some questions. And I think you can now see a poster that says weaving together the health and well-being of our children. And there's actually, this is a photo of the some of the sage bundles that Danielle was just smudging the room with, or smudging our shared space with. So on this photo or on this poster, I'm not sure if you can read it or not. We've got a couple of quotes and questions. In native languages, the term for plants translate to those who take care of us. And what I'd like to think about right now are what are some of the actions that we can take as individuals, or while we're working with children, what actions can we do with the children? What can we model that will create a relevant, respectful, reciprocal relationship with plants? And as you're creating those relationships with plants, you can think about how that creates a greater connection with the land. And it doesn't even have to be plants. So for example, Danielle and I are on a committee that are creating a new childcare here at Vancouver Island University. And the piece of land that we've got for it, it's a difficult spot to build on. And there's one area that's really quite wet at certain times of the year because there's a lot of rainfall. And so we thought, instead of trying to just funnel all that water away, can we turn that into a rain garden? Mm-hmm. And think of what plants would really like to be in that very wet area. How can the children be in that wetter space? What kind of relationships will they create? What kind of learning will they gain from that environment? So this is perhaps if we could all focus on this question together.
The one thing that, I was just, when I was listening to you about the daycare and thinking about how do we create and be with the environment, when I'm looking at medicines as well, and when I'm noticing the different seasons, I'm very careful to observe what's happening with each season and what medicines are showing up. And, they have such a responsibility to look after us. Like right now, you see those beautiful snowberries, and those snowberries are for, protection. And we use this for a lot of ceremonial uses. You don't ingest it. It's very poisonous. So I would not recommend eating it, but it's something that we use as a topical piece. And so when I look outside and I'm looking at the plants, they're in tune with every season of what's happening for all of our different pieces of our life. In the summertime, they get us ready for the winter with the blackberries, and they want us to start preparing to gather food and having abundance of food because they know it's going to be a cold winter. So it's so interesting for me to think about that they sit with those words. They're already in their actions of being reciprocal and being respectful, and they are being super responsible. These plants are teaching us these 4 R's all the time. And what aspects as a human, what do we do in our relationship, in our commitment to looking after them? And then that creates that bond, right? And that attachment, that real attachment that, sometimes we think about attachment from an educator perspective. And from an Indigenous perspective, that attachment is with the land, with the plants. And how do we incorporate that with children so that they can see that there's so much meaning within our relationship, that it's not just an extractive place. It's not just a place to walk. It's not just there. There's real deep pieces of our where they want to look after us and look after our spiritual well-being. Iris, that's my doctorate research, is spiritual development and early childhood development from an Indigenous perspective. So that's where my research sits. And when you're thinking about this question, I just want to, I don't feel scared about it. Just think about, when was your last memory of where you felt connected with plants? And what was your feeling about your action about that? And action doesn't mean like I'm doing a checklist. It means, what was your initial feeling to wanting to continue to do this within your practice? Maybe it's creating that beautiful garden space outside. Maybe it's that conversation you had with that child in the program and spoke to the changes. And I had this beautiful reading group, and we were talking about the first snowfall, that snowfall that we had, that beautiful snowfall, and how children, they get into this task mode of let's build something. But there was this one little one that was really observant about the leaf and how it froze. And she was sitting there looking at this leaf because of the change from the temperature and the snow and the ice and what it actually did to the leaf. And that was powerful for this educator, because she realized we need to stop and start to see and reflect with children, because they're observing things for the very first time. And how do we create that wonderful space and curiosity to help them deepen their thoughts by sitting with them and observing with them and being able to witness those beautiful moments and making those connections and those threads and being able to continue that place of discussion. So I just really want, when you're with your group, to think of one of those beautiful moments you might have had with a child, beautiful moment with yourself, and how does that feel for you, and how do you express it? Because if you're holding it inside, it's like my late grandmother would say that we're encouraging you to have more voice to this. When you have more voice to it, then it becomes more concrete. And I don't like the word concrete, but it's creating this more grounding of who you're becoming. And that's that we call it our slihe. So slihe is your spirit. So your slihe, and then your voice and your mind and everything, when you're talking, you're giving intention to that. And that's another place of connection to your well-being, is having that space to have your slihe speak to those pieces of you that are really important.
Thank you, Danielle, for reminding us that it is really part of our everyday lives. It's just that we tend to not pay attention to it, and we kind of tend to forget about it unless, like you suggest, we'll start to pay attention to these moments. And I know that, Shannon, you had your hand up for a while, and I don't know if you want to ask something or add something.
No, I was just more, it's related type of question. I know, I don't know how to position this. A lot of children, it's been my experiences and observations in different programming and things like that. They're all very interested and intrigued by everything around them and the plants and the trees and all of that. And they always want to touch and feel everything. And so in my work, I look at sensory perceptual development and those types of things. So of course, I'm also looking for how people interact from the senses and the touch and things like that. But really where my question's going is so many young children and even older children, they want to feel the leaves and things like that. But it's always this little bit of like, we want to tear it up. We want to pull things off the trees. Like there's that element of destructive, not for destructive purposes, but for learning purposes, like how, things feel and so forth. And I'm never quite sure to know how to handle that, when designing lessons and things like that, because from someone who, looks at sensory development, and learning about how things feel and the smell and all of those types of things, they're bringing in, so much information and processing that information, but it's almost too at the same time creating some imbalance wherein, is that harming the relationship between them and them looking at the leaf and ripping it up? So I guess what I'm saying is, what are your thoughts on that? How do you handle that, so that you're still, being very respectful and connecting to that plant, to that tree, etc., while also, garnering those physical, sensory, perceptual types of information that's what they're trying to get. And so I don't know if that makes sense, but I was just, more curious, what your thoughts are on that and how you go about handling that, or if my question just is very convoluted.
I love your question, and I've gone back to the share because I want to kind of focus in on this photo of bergamot. And you can see that there's a little bee having, spending some time getting some food from that particular flower. Now, bergamot is a plant that is quite safe to have in childcare programs. It's non-poisonous. You can make tea with it. It looks beautiful. And despite the fact that I could harvest these plants and make tea from them, I very rarely do. And it's because I see how much my insect neighbors enjoy that particular plant. And so I think that what I'm trying to say is, the answer depends on the situation. Why are you doing what you're doing? What's the purpose? Thinking about what are your harvesting protocols? Is this the first plant that you've seen? Because if it is, and you pick it and you rip it up, what if it was the last plant in that area as well? So there's so many different things to look at. There's also, how are you making the decision? Because like you, I am all for children interacting with plants. That's why I believe in children having plants in their early years program, whether it's in the traditional Western style garden, whether it's in a more Indigenous style, where the plants are sort of scattered and living with us, whether it's in pots, because that's what you've got, and perhaps even in pots on wheels so that they can be moved around, because you don't have a lot of space and you need to figure out, well, if we have to play here, we're going to have to move that plant, right? So that you can think about that space, or that perhaps the plant has to move around during the day just so it can get enough sunlight, depending on where you are. So that's stopping and really asking questions. Danielle, did you want to speak to introducing yourself to the plant, or would you like me to?
Yeah, no, I was actually, that's what first came forward in my mind. And she loved to pull the plants right out, like really like pull. And I was like, whoa, I'm like, what's happening here? And she's like, oh, I just want to get some flowers for you. And I'm like, oh, but we can look at them just by right here and we can enjoy them and look at, they're like a little family here. And she's like, oh, they're a family? I'm like, yeah, they're a family. And so she's like, then she went and I said, but our hands are pretty strong. So how can we be gentle? And so she would just put her hands and she would touch the beautiful little flowers. And I just wanted her just to see how we can see beauty outside without having to take it, without having to extract it, and to be and that motion. And even with trees, when you're talking about trees, you know, like she would pull, and I'm like, oh, how would that feel on your arm if someone came up to you right and you didn't even know them and they started pulling your arm? And she's like, oh, I wouldn't like that. I'm like, no, I don't think trees like that either. You know, I think they want to be hugged. And so we would go right to the park right by my house. And that was what we would do. We would run and go give hugs to the cedar trees. That was one of our things when we went for a walk. We'd just go and hug. And I would get her to say her native name, and say who she's from, her nation. Nice to meet you. And she still does this today. 2 years later, she will go to a tree. She will say her name. She will say, I'm from this nation. And then she gives a hug. And then even when we went cedar stripping, her first time cedar stripping, she was spending time, she was doing patty cake with the tree. She's like, this is one of my best friends now. Can we come back and see her? And she was having this connection. And it was quite beautiful for me to witness, to see that she has shifted in her mindset. And I agree that there's places where there's that deep sensory feeling, but sometimes it can be a very gentle sensory experience as well, where their hands are just being able to see the bark and maybe spending time with things that are like in the dirt where they can move it so that they can get that real experience of being in their hands and the smell and getting that whole sensory space of feeling. And I think when I explained to her that it was like an arm, that shifted for her in the sense of wanting to take care. And we saw this beautiful little cedar tree, and she called it Princess. She's like, this is Princess. And she went to give it a hug. And I was getting her to see that it was the same height as her. And so she's like, we're the same age. And it was beautiful because she was starting to have these different connections. And then there was another tree right beside Princess that was dying. And she's like, what's going on? This does not look right. And I said, I'm sorry. I'm like, look at the leaves and it's not well, honey. Like, it's not well. And it looks like it's dying. And she put her hands right on the branch and she just closed her eyes and she said, we really need you in this planet. We really need you. We need you to get better. Please get better. And then she gave it a little hug. And I'm feeling emotional when I'm saying it because it's just quite beautiful when you witness children and this was her expression and her connection to our time, just being in nature and being with the trees. And that these moments can happen all the time if we allow it and give space to it and really give them that opportunity to really think about, what is my connection to our outside world? And I have another quick little story about insects, because insects are another place for children love to grab and play with and explore and think about. And I had one little guy that loved like worms. That was one of his big passions of going outside, was to find worms. And a lot of educators did not want to go and see it. But I was like, I remember I was like, nope, if I don't want that to be the response, I don't want that to be the response. Like, oh, what do you have there? So even though I'm sensory and I don't really like, for me, I don't really like that feeling either. But I was like, put my hands out. Okay, what did you find today? And so I would just create this excitement because this was something that he loved doing every day. And so I put my hands out and then we were like, oh, wow, look how long he is. And then we just had this beautiful space. And And then he was really enjoying it because now he could share it with me. And he knew he didn't have to go run around to look at the other educators. He knew that I was open, and he would come straight to me to show me every day what worm he found. And I think that's something when we think about just not even plants, but the insects, just to think about what is this job of this worm? What does he actually do? Like having these beautiful connections so they can see that they have an important role and they have important teachings for us, and that even though they're small, they have great jobs to do as well in looking after us. And I was cleaning I have one more quick story before we go into our question, because I keep feeling the story in my head. Is I was cleaning my outrigger outside, and there's this spider, this mom spider, and all her babies, and they were just sitting there. And I was gonna just go wash it, and I looked over and I said, "Oh no, this is her mom and all her babies." And so I put a stick just really close by to her, and I said, I'm going to be using my outrigger soon, and I'm going to go paddle, but I don't want you to get harmed or your babies. Can you please move on to the stick? And I don't want to touch your babies because my hands are too, I think I would squish your little babies. And I felt like, when you're talking and you're thinking, this is a crazy conversation you're having. And are they really hearing this? That was what I was feeling at that moment. But as I just let go of that insecurity, Danielle, we have connection, we have relationship. This is a beautiful mom spider with all her beautiful babies. And I said, I just want all your babies and you to be okay. I'll come back in a couple hours just to see how you're doing. So I left, and then I came back, and she moved all her babies onto that stick. All of them. They were all moved, and then I carefully moved her from that stick with all her babies into a safe location. So I just want you guys to realize that, they do listen. They do hear us. And there is a connection, and that was a real, she understood she needed to move those babies. And that, sometimes we think, oh, well, just squish them, or, well, whatever. It's just no, they have a purpose to why they're there.
Shannon, I was thinking about your question, and one of the things that the children can also do is tell the plant why they're picking the plant. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when we have to say out loud or even think about why are we doing it, it stops us enough to give us a check, to give us a pause. Because when we ask the plant, sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that plant doesn't want to be picked. Sometimes it's not the right time or the right reason. And so hopefully you can start to listen to that and think about when it is the right time. And, some plants really are meant to be picked. They do well when they're picked. So at this time of the year, it can often be a good time to, for example, cut parts of your willow to make wreaths. And all that will happen is that your willow will grow back bushier and better afterwards, right? Some plants don't do well with cutting and picking, and other ones do. When you think about your potatoes in the garden, you might be digging them up. And some potatoes really spread out a lot, depending on the type. And so you might not get them all. And next year, you'll just have potatoes popping up in different spots that, you weren't expecting. But you're lucky enough to have that. Does that help? Does that answer your question a little?
No, I think it absolutely does, because again, I'm taking it from a perspective of a sensory perspective. There's lots of important things that you glean from that, but I also always want to situate it in learning and creating that eco-psychological self, that stewardness towards the land and that relationship between all aspects of the land and learning how to balance that with getting information versus protection and building relationships and so forth. So you gave, lots of different types of ideas and strategies. And I agree that's 100% that every situation is different and you have to, really figure out the situation at hand. But yeah, that's a lot of, things to think about, and ways to, guide and teach young people on, just that simple act of, let's look at what this leaf is and feel it and stuff, and trying to find that balance for a child. So thank you. No, thank you very much.
Feeling it, smelling it, perhaps tasting it.
Yes.
When I think about the summertime, it's hot. We want the children to be hydrated. And so if you've got plantings that are safe, and I'm really emphasizing the safe, because sometimes things that we as adults might drink might not be very good for children, right? St. John's wort tea, for example, is something that adults might drink, but you wouldn't want to give that to children at all, right? So you might not want that planted in your outdoor space, or you might not want that around the children because it is a medicinal plant. But for example, I'm going to go to mint. A lot of people will say, oh, mint, it really spreads. You got to watch it. And that's true, but that's also what makes it perfect for when we're working with young children, because it is a very safe plant, and they can pick some of that mint and they can crush it in their hand, and they can put it into their water bottle, and then they'll have that beautiful mint flavored water, or rosemary flavored water, or sage flavored water, or lemon balm, or you can see where this is going, right? There's lots of options. And so they can have that opportunity to taste things and to try things, and to still ensure that there's something there for others, that we're always thinking about sharing that with others. And that's why speaking out loud, or thinking in your heart of what are you going to do with this? And learning from it is perfectly valid. And I love the way plants can sometimes even let us know where we are just by the scent of them. And if we're talking about sensory gardens, for example, for children who are vision impaired, you might want to have a big planting of one plant, because that way they really know exactly which plant they're interacting with, and they get to know what type of plant it is by feeling the stem, right? It's like, oh, that plant's in the mint family because it's got the square stem. Or I can tell by the smell that this is, or the feel of the leaves. And some plants aren't edible, but they feel wonderful to touch. And other plants can be dangerous to touch. So particularly here on the West Coast, I'm from the prairies, and there's way more dangerous plants here than there are in the prairies. So, being aware as the adult with the children, what are the safe plants to touch and what are not? And talking about that with children.
Even when you're picking the plant too, when you introduce yourself and your name and who you are, it like Sheila was saying, you'll get a yes or no answer. And when I go and pick cedar, for instance, I'll talk to the cedar, and if it feels like I'm trying to break it to pull it off and it doesn't want to come off, I'll say, okay, no, you don't want to come. So I'm really clear that they have a choice in wanting to come. And even I've got these little echoes, and these echoes we use for protection around our house. So this just bounces off, and it bounces off any negative energy. It'll bounce off these little echoes. And when I ask permission, because they live on stumps, they live in moist areas, and I go up to it and I put my hand on it and I'm talking to it. And if it wants to come freely, then I know it's really meant for me. But if it doesn't want to come, then I'm saying thank you, and then I move forward. And I'm really conscious of that, because I don't want to force it because I'm strong. I'm just really, and I'm gently just seeing, is it feeling like a tug, or is it feeling really natural? That comes with leaves and all those pieces. And when I'm picking leaves for teas, I don't just take the one plant and strip it all of its leaves. I go over one leaf and I go to another place, get another leaf. I take my time. Even strawberry plants, we go from one section to another section so that it gives space for that plant, so it doesn't feel a lot of tugging. And my little one, when we went and got strawberries, she's like, "Can I please have you?" And she'll ask questions, like she'll go around, and she, then you can see there's a shift in her when she's eating those strawberries too. She's like, "I asked permission. Now look at this little, basket that I got," and she's really enjoying it. So when children see that different relationship from the grocery store and getting food, it becomes a different feeling for them in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Because it is possible to have more of a reciprocal relationship with plants. Instead of always just taking, we can also think about what can we give to the plants? What type of exchange do we have, right? When I compost and I put that in my garden, it's a gift to the plants because I would like them to be healthy. When you collect rain in a rain barrel and children can access that water, they might choose to bring it to the sand area to play with, or they might choose to share it with the plants that are maybe looking a little bit droopy, right? So thinking about what actions can we do, not as caregivers or owners of plants, but as people who are learning from and with plants. And how do we share with plants?